Hello and welcome to the brand new Cruse Cares podcast. This is the first episode of our 6-part series about bereavement to mark Cruse Bereavement Care's 60th anniversary. I'm Jessica Mitchell. I'm the managing editor for the Bereavement Care Journal and a counsellor specialising in bereavement. In this series, we'll be talking to people who've experienced a bereavement and asking them about their own personal grief journey. We hope to show the different ways people grieve and to show that if you're grieving, you're not alone. And maybe you'll also feel a bit inspired and hear some useful advice along the way too. If you need emotional support following a bereavement, you can visit our website www.cruse.org.uk. Cruse is spelled C-R-U-S-E. That has lots of helpful information and advice on the website. Feel free to follow our social media accounts for regular updates on our work and to interact with other people who are grieving. Our handles on Twitter and Instagram are @Cruse Care, and you can find us on Facebook under Cruse Bereavement Care. And now on to today's guest. We're joined by freelance writer Florence Wilkinson. Hi, Florence.
Hi there.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming in today to talk to us.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, Florence, about your mother, Sarah. Sarah, okay. So, Florence, I wanted to ask you about your mother, Sarah. She died when you were 24 and you're 31 now, so about 7 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, do you mind just telling us a bit about your mum?
Sure, yeah. My mum and I had a really close relationship, so I'm an only child, and I spent kind of a lot of my time with her growing up. And yeah, very fond memories actually. I think I'm very fortunate in that I sort of grew up feeling confident in the knowledge that I was completely and absolutely loved by my parents, and obviously my mum was a big part of that. And I think one of the other things I really gained from her was that my mother was absolutely and resolutely herself always, and that's definitely a lesson that I took from her too. What else do you want to know? Do you want to know a bit about kind of who she was and what she did? Or
yeah, that would be great if you did. I wonder if first you'd be willing to tell us just a bit about how it was that your mum actually died. Was she ill?
Yeah, so my mum had a terminal condition, which is actually quite rare. So she'd been managing that condition for a few years, kind of on an unlicensed drug trial. And basically it got to the point where she was aware that if she kind of carried on as she was, she would eventually die, and potentially not in a very nice way because she had a heart-lung condition. There was the option of her trying an operation, which came with risks, and we were all aware of the risks, although because it's quite a rare condition, quite a rare procedure, is kind of it was hard to say how big those risks might be. But we were told that if successful, the operation would either make her quality of life a bit better, or a lot better, and potentially extend her life a large amount. So it was quite tricky because I guess we went into the decision, and she made the decision to have the operation, which I think was a brave decision. I probably still think it was the right decision, but obviously we went into that with hope. And she went into hospital. She made it through the operation, but then she was in for hospital for a couple of months after that. And yeah, in the end, she didn't make it. So it was quite difficult circumstances, because although I say she was terminally ill, we kind of hoped that the operation might be her ticket out of that and, to a better life. So it was challenging.
Yeah, I'm really so sorry to hear that, Florence, and thank you for being so open about it. She was obviously, if you were only 24 when she died, then she was a young woman herself.
Yeah, she was 57, and I think one of the things that everyone would say about my mum was that she loved life. And she was someone who kind of loved different experiences. And although she was only 57 when she died, she did an extraordinary amount of different things during that time. So she trained as a nurse, she did an English degree, she trained as a teacher, a cabinet maker, she learnt to make jewellery, she learnt to carve in wood and stone, and ultimately became a sculptor. She wrote children's stories. So she did a huge amount, even though her life was cut short. And again, that's sort of something that's always influenced me and my life choices. I've always felt that I got the strength from her to kind of try different things and go out and get different experiences.
Yeah, she sounds really incredible. I think it was very, it really struck me what you said, actually, that she was always herself, and that has given you, really informed, actually, how you've lived. And that is an incredible privilege, isn't it, to really know somebody like that.
Yeah, and I think I always felt that she knew me like that, and she was my kind of constant advocate for whatever I was doing, which gave me strength. And obviously it was really difficult when I lost that, but in some ways I still carry it with me because that's kind of shaped who I am today.
And what was it like? I mean, you were an adult at 24, but still a very young adult, and most of your contemporaries probably had not experienced such a loss. What was that like, to have your mum die at such a young age?
I think that was particularly challenging, actually, because I was fortunate then, and I am now, in that I think I've got quite a wide circle of very close friends. I'm fortunate to know lots of wonderful people, and so I've never felt lonely. And actually, growing up as an only child, my mum was really conscious that I should be surrounded by friends all the time. So I had friends round all the time. We took my friends on holiday with us and that kind of thing. So I think it was the first time in my life that I ever experienced kind of feeling lonely. And it's a strange sort of loneliness, because I still had all those people around me. It wasn't like I didn't have anyone to talk to or turn to, but I guess because none of them had that experience, I was kind of isolated and alone in my experience. And that was the really tough part. And I think also I probably didn't have the tools or really know how to ask my friends to support me either. So for them, and a lot of them really did want to support and do the right thing, and they might not have known how, and I didn't know how to ask. So I guess that was a particularly tricky thing too.
So you had that sense that sometimes people who are bereaved talk about almost being in a kind of parallel dimension, or in a bubble within their grief. Was that the kind of sense that you had at that point, that isolated you to some extent from other people?
Absolutely. I mean, I remember I think it was maybe just a couple of days after my mum died, trying to go out with my then boyfriend, and I remember we went to the South Bank because I like the London Aquarium, so I thought it might be a good idea to go there. And then I just realised I sort of couldn't go in, and I had this strange feeling because I was sort of standing on the South Bank. It's obviously a busy area, lots of people, tourists, people going to work, and it was just a strange feeling. How was their world just going on as normal when my world was caving in? And it's really odd. I've sort of read I've read bits and pieces that people have written about it subsequently. Perhaps they can describe it more eloquently than I can, but yeah, it's this very odd kind of topsy-turvy, upside down, you're there but you're not feeling. That feeling does pass, and you do kind of gradually feel like you're moving back into the same world as everyone else, but it can be really difficult at first. I always remember as well the train journey back from the hospital after my mum died with my dad, and we were both in a real state of shock as well. It's very surreal. It's hard to describe unless you've actually been there.
I think that actually, Florence, the way you talked about that really certainly brings it to mind for me, that sense of standing in the busy South Bank that we all know, watching people rushing by, while you're isolated in a very, very different space from all these holiday makers and just people out having a good time. Yeah. And you said, I think too, actually, you've talked about maybe this sense, at 24, right, people are leading a kind of carefree life. Or at least, maybe we associate that with being young. And was there a sense of a loss of that being carefree at a kind of unexpectedly young age?
Yeah, and it's interesting because the one thing that my mum was always most strong on was that she wanted me to be happy. And I think when I was young, she did a lot to try and kind of make sure that I didn't have too much weight on my young shoulders, as it were. And so I think, I probably before that was quite carefree, not in a reckless sense. I think, there's this idea sometimes that young people can be carefree in a reckless sense. I don't think I was like that. I don't think most young people actually are like that. But yeah, certainly it kind of, all of a sudden your world is flipped and you've got this kind of horrible new reality that you're living with, and it does sort of tinge and impact kind of everything around you and sort of the way that you view the world, and yeah, when you're young, I guess that has a particularly strong impact, because also I guess I didn't really have any proper experience of loss either. So although unfortunately my grandmother died shortly before my mother, so it kind of all hit at once. But I think, by that point I was in such a blur that I didn't really process that. So yeah.
What was your initial response then, in some ways, in those first days and weeks? How did you respond to your mother's death?
So, kind of the initial feeling is really hard to describe, because I feel like you're living moment to moment. And when I've subsequently talked to friends who've lost parents and tried to give them some support, the key things that I always say kind of in the early days is just making sure that you do the absolute basics. Make sure that you try and get some sleep, make sure that you eat, make sure that if you can, you try and get outside and see some sunshine or go for a walk, because at that point I think that's the most that you can expect to do, and I think it hits people at different times and in different ways, because it's too much of a thing to process all at once anyway. So I think in those early days I was probably just in some kind of strange whirlwind, but one thing that I've talked about and written about is this sort of excess of energy that I had as a result, and not really knowing what to do with that. And I think quite a few people have that experience. So for me, I sort of started madly trying to gather up any photographs we had of my mum and put them into a book, or pull together any kind of little video clips, because I suddenly panicked that I'd forget what she sounded like or forget what she looked like, which now is kind of feels ridiculous, because I'm never going to forget what she looks like or sounds like, or what it felt like to hug her, or the texture of her hair, or any of those sort of things. They stay with you forever, but at the time, that was kind of what I was focused on. I think there can be a little bit of a sort of a friend of mine and I have laughed about this subsequently. You get this weird sort of hoarding mentality as well, I think, where you sort of want to hoard up anything that you might have relating to that person and kind of keep it all obsessively. And some people talk about kind of going out on kind of shopping sprees as well, and sort of trying to fill this hole that you can't quite process or understand with material things. But I think there's definitely kind of that hoarding thing. And for years even still now, there's things that relate to my mum that I have that I won't throw away, even though I can hear my mum like laughing in my head and saying how ridiculous it is. And yet I still can't bring myself to get rid of them, which is a strange thing. Or, you know, things that I mean, I have a lot of things relating to my mum because she was a sculptor. So I'm really fortunate to have kind of her sculptures around me, and I'm wearing a necklace that she made today because I've got all her jewelry and that kind of thing. So it kind of makes it all the more ludicrous that I can't throw away an old hairbrush that I know she bought years and years ago. But yeah, it is a strange reaction I think people have. Incidentally, I did bin the hairbrush eventually, but only when we moved house recently. So I think my partner despairs a bit because I collect things, and then I've got all these things from my mum, so he doesn't like clutter.
Okay, but actually you call it up really well, all those maybe little objects that seem insignificant in and of themselves, but actually perhaps recall to you your mother, I don't know, the hairbrush, brushing her hair or something important that bring back something much richer than just the object itself, really.
Yeah.
I think you also said you reacted with quite a sort of this ferocious energy. I mean, you were, you are a journalist, but you were back at work within like a week, weren't you? And things, and traveling.
Yeah. So, well, I basically sort of threw myself into everything. I mean, I think it's really different for different people, and it's so important to recognize that, because so back then I was kind of working in marketing and communications, working for an agency, and I went back after a week, and I remember sort of some people being quite shocked about that, some people being very supportive, some not so much, or not really knowing how, but for me, I felt like I was going to feel like absolute crap whatever I was doing, and actually I wanted something to distract myself. It was more painful for me, the idea of kind of sitting at home and being alone in my thoughts. I didn't want that. I'd rather try and do something. I mean, I was probably looking back pretty useless at work, but I felt like at least I could get something done, And then I went away to India with a friend for a couple of weeks. I mean, I think that's quite common, certainly amongst kind of my friends now who've lost parents and kind of lost them in their 20s. A lot of people, I think, tend to go away for a bit. I think that helps. Different sites, kind of different experiences, perhaps less triggering than the things around you at home. But yeah, I kind of got back into things quite quickly. And I think, looking back, I don't think I would do any of that differently either. I think it probably did help me. And I always say that the thing is, whatever you can do to get through those initial few weeks and months and somehow keep going and gradually get to a point where you feel like your life has the value and meaning that you need again, there's no right or wrong way, really.
Yeah, it's really good to hear that, actually, because in this work, it's one thing we're always keen to say, that people think, oh, I'm not doing this right. I'm not crying enough, or I'm crying too much. And we're actually saying, no, however you're doing it and however you get through this is the right way. And I think, you seem to have said that really clearly, actually, that you had to find your own way of being okay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the one trouble with that was that I think... and I've written about this, but a lot of people as a result kind of said to me, oh, you're so strong. And I think a lot of people thought I was very strong. And maybe strong is a word that I would use to describe myself. I can be, I guess, quite determined and forceful when I've got an idea in my head, that's for sure. But just because somebody seems like they're getting on with things, or they seem like they're coping well, and doesn't mean that their pain isn't as acute. And I think for anyone supporting someone going through grief, it's quite important to be aware of that just because someone seems like they're coping with it, and maybe they are, but that doesn't mean that they're not feeling as much pain as someone else who seems to be kind of coping less well. Yeah.
Have you found that that's changed in a sense over time? I mean, as you've moved on in these years since your mother's death, are there still, I guess, moments where it hits you as forcefully as ever? And then allied to that, times when you feel very much better. But that sense that actually you can be right back in those awful first days.
Yeah, I was talking to a good friend and colleague about this because he lost his father when he was very young. I think he was about 13 or something. He was a teenager anyway. And now he's in his late 30s, and he went away with his partner not so long ago, and I won't give the specifics, but they went to a certain place that shouldn't really have any emotional attachment for them necessarily, and then this friend of mine just started crying uncontrollably, and his partner couldn't understand it, and it's this interesting thing where so many years can pass, but something can trigger you, and when it does, you're kind of right back there in the moment, and yeah, it's a difficult one. I think I was on holiday in Cuba a few years ago with my partner, and quite a bit of time had elapsed already since my mum had died, and then I just heard a piece of music playing, and it set me off. And I think for someone who's not been through it and who's kind of trying to support you like a partner or a friend, that can be quite confusing to understand and process. But yeah, sometimes it does. It could be anything. It could be a sound, a sight, a place, a smell, anything really, but it can just set you off. I think it's just about being aware that might happen, and accepting that it's okay. Sometimes your grief kind of needs to come out in a more intense way, and that's all right, as long as you're prepared that might happen at some point, I guess, and then people around you need to be understanding about that.
Have you found that people in your family, each of you, grieved differently? I mean, your dad, your stepmom, yourself. There's an assumption perhaps that people might be similar, but actually we talked about this, how people do grieve differently. And did you find that even within your family?
Yeah, absolutely. And so my parents weren't together anymore, but remained close. And then my mum's partner, I'm very close to her as well, my stepmom. So she and I grieved quite differently, and I was talking to her about that on the way here, actually, about the different ways in which we grieved. So, for example, she put a lot of pictures of my mum up around the house, to the point at which she kind of joked and said, like, "Oh, I know, it's embarrassing, like the house seems like some kind of mausoleum," and she said, "I know Sarah would have thought this was ridiculous and been very embarrassed by it." And on the flip side, I, until very recently, didn't feel strong enough to have pictures of my mum up around me in my house because I found that too triggering. And so what I would do is sort of on her birthday, I'd post a picture on social media and kind of write something about her, and that's what I would do each year, and I'd find that hard, but I felt like it was something that I needed to do, also because I wanted to remind other people of her and want other people to still be thinking of her, but I didn't feel like I could have pictures of her up, because if I just sort of caught one of them out of the corner of my eye, it might set me off. I've got to a point now where I can have pictures of my mum up, and actually, so I mentioned that I moved house quite recently, and I've just put up a few pictures of her in frames, kind of amongst the other pictures as well, of kind of my partner and his family and that kind of thing. And meanwhile, my stepmom has managed to take some of the pictures down. So I think we've reached a kind of nice stage of equilibrium between us now, which is nice. But I think, and the main thing is that she and I always recognised that the way in which we were grieving and grieved would be different, but that we would always have each other and support each other. And that's been a really, really good thing for me. I think, the last thing that you want is to kind of shut people out at that kind of time. And you all have to be understanding. And likewise, I hope that I've been able to be understanding about my friends as well. Some of them were brilliant. Some probably weren't as good. But that doesn't mean that they're bad people. You have to be understanding, and it's difficult not to expect too much of people, particularly when you're going through something terrible. But I think, in the long run, it's you who will suffer as well if you expect too much from others. You have to understand that everyone's human, and this is something that we're all trying to learn how to process and deal with.
Gosh, I think that is just so lovely to hear, Florence, about that, because I come across so many people who put the bereaved person puts pressure on themselves to get it right, and then friends and family the same thing, feeling like they're getting it wrong, and then people can wind up shutting down to one another rather than reaching out at that incredibly difficult time. It's just really nice to hear you recognizing that and accepting that people don't always get it right in that incredibly pressured time.
Yeah. I mean, and I've got some friends who have sort of lost friends over this, and sort of said that you find out who your real friends are when you go through something like this. And I mean, don't get me wrong, like that is certainly true to a certain extent too. And if you have people who call themselves your friends and are completely rubbish and just sort of abandon you or shut you down or anything like that, then feel free to bin them as far as I'm concerned. But on the other hand, like I say, you do have to be understanding about other people, because if someone's not been through this experience, they don't know what it feels like. And I think one of the bigger things as well is that I found different friends have helped me in different ways. So some friends were particularly good kind of immediately afterwards, and whereas others didn't really know what to do at that point. Some people kind of forget to keep asking. Others remember kind of every single year or at different points to ask, or some people who might not have been there as much kind of in the immediate term, but I've stayed friends with them, and as they've grown older and kind of we've matured together, they've been a great comfort to me years later. So I think different people will probably help in different ways. I think one of the things that really gets me is kind of a couple of my close friends. So one of my close friends, I sort of found out a few years later that she had been giving a donation monthly to the hospital that looked after my mum, and that meant so much to me. Kind of the fact that she hadn't even told me that she was doing it as well kind of made it all the more powerful, because it felt like she was doing it for my mum as well. And another friend had a baby with a few years ago, and his birthday is the same as my mum's, and they give a donation from him in memory of my mum on his birthday, which is really lovely as well. So that kind of thing is really, really touching. Like I say, I'm lucky. I've got some wonderful people in my life.
Oh, I'm glad. I mean, in a way, those things also sound like about how others might be keeping a connection with your mother and keeping her alive and her spirit in their minds too. And is that something? I mean, how have you, in a sense, included your mother in your life? Because actually, I mean, I guess I'm thinking when your mum dies so young, too, is actually you lose the future. Yeah. With her as well, and that many expected big events you won't get to share with her. So how have you been able to keep her alive in your life?
And that's an interesting one and a tricky one, because again, I've spoken to friends who've had this similar experience of losing parents, and one of the things that might seem strange to someone who hasn't been through it is that actually in some ways it can get sadder over time, because the time since you last saw them has got longer, and you know, it is a difficult feeling that you are kind of growing into a person and learning things and doing things and not being able to talk to someone who you were so close to about it. You know, quite often my stepmom or my dad will say, like, I wish that I could talk to Sarah about this, or my uncle as well. And so, yeah, that's a difficult thing, knowing that she won't know kind of who I am now, and you know, all these little things as well, and big things, kind of small decisions that I might make and huge world events, and I want to know what she thinks about them. And so that is a really, really tricky thing. And I think those little things for me are actually kind of harder to deal with, or perhaps more upsetting than the big life events. So, you know, a lot of people talk about not being able to have their parent there at a wedding or that kind of thing. That wasn't not having my mum there. I mean, perhaps it says something about my views on matrimony, but not having my mum there at my wedding, to me, is not somehow as upsetting as not being able to talk to her about the little things and the things, the things that are going on in my life and the world. But how do I keep her alive? I almost don't feel like I have to, because she is such a big part of who I am. And I guess that makes it a bit harder for me to answer the question. But because our relationship was so close, and because, you know, even when now as I get older, I kind of look in the mirror and I think, oh my God, I look like her. I must be getting older. And sometimes I hear her when I laugh as well. I sort of catch myself sounding like her as well. I think, and my stepmom's always said that. She's always said, like, she is kind of a big part of you. So she's always there. I kind of don't even have to do anything in that sense, because I think she is such a big part of me. But yeah, I've got her things around me as well, which helps.
And do you find days, I mean, we're doing this talk right around Mother's Day, and I know, you know, she died in March, and that's when we're recording this. Do you find anniversaries and things like Mother's Day particularly difficult, or?
So I find them all difficult. Her birthday, I try to sort of celebrate more. And that's more the time where I like to think about her, and I can think nice things about her, I think. I try not to think too much about the anniversary of her death, just because for me it's not really a day I particularly like to mark. But it's this strange thing where kind of in the run-up to that anniversary, before I even realise that it's coming, I start having weird or not very nice dreams quite often. And I sort of dream that, is she alive, or is she dead, or is she going to make it? And I think it's sort of reliving that experience we had when she was in hospital, where we kept on hoping that she was going to pull through, and then she didn't. So it definitely impacts me, even if it's sort of beneath the surface and not something I'm kind of outwardly conscious about. Mother's Day, I don't think it would have that big of an impact, except that now, I guess because of the materialistic society we live in, my inbox is always flooded with "don't forget Mum, buy flowers for Mum," etc. And I find that really irritating. But I think perhaps it's also to do with kind of the value that you place on anniversaries and that kind of thing, just in your day-to-day life. So, you know, my parents never thought that Mother's and Father's Day were a big deal. And so because it wasn't, although I'd obviously always do a card and that kind of thing, because it wasn't a big part of our relationship, I guess it's not as tricky for me now, if that makes any sense.
It really does, yeah. And do you find, Florence, I wanted to ask you, have there been unexpected aspects to this whole journey? I know that you were talking earlier about finding sometimes humour in this, or that your mother might, be making jokes and saying, "Oh my God, what are you all doing?" And so have there been unexpected aspects to all of this for you?
Yeah, I mean, and my mum was always the centre of the party and always kind of making jokes and making people laugh and entertaining people. So yeah, I mean, I guess there's that. There's all kinds of things that happen to you when you're grieving that you can't anticipate either. I think it's probably made me more ambitious, which is, I mean, I know that a lot of people want to channel their grief into a positive, so they'll go and kind of support a charity or even set up a charity or that kind of thing. I think for me, because there's this strange feeling that something was missing, even when it's not kind of in the forefront of your mind, it means that I was probably for a long time always seeking. And mind you, I've probably always been quite ambitious anyway, I think my mum would say so. But yeah, and I guess, no, I mean, really, the whole thing is going to surprise you at different points because you just don't know how you're going to feel or react until you're put into this situation. It's kind of mad, really, because obviously death is such a huge part of all of our lives, but and always will be, and it's always going to impact everyone. I mean, we're all going to die, but it's a strange thing where I guess we don't really talk about it a lot in our society. And yeah, because it's such an individual experience, I think there's always going to be kind of twists and turns and things that you can't expect or plan for. Some people sort of talk about it making them stronger, that kind of ethos. I don't know if I particularly subscribe to that, because I just kind of think, well, I'd rather just have my mum back. But yeah. I don't know if that's a very helpful answer.
It's absolutely, it really is. There's so many different aspects to being bereaved, isn't there? And it's something that we carry with us our whole lives, isn't it? It's not something that's over immediately and your mother lives on with you. Is there anything you'd like to say to people who actually are out there right now listening and are going through this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I remember feeling kind of in the immediate days after losing my mum, like, how am I ever going to learn to live with this? Like, how am I ever going to carry on? How am I going to be able to breathe and eat and, exist and beyond that, kind of ever enjoy existing and find joy in life again? And at the same time knowing that obviously that's what my mom would want more than anything for me. So for anyone listening to this, I just want you to know that you will learn to live with it. Grief is not something that you ever get over, or anything that goes away, and neither should it be, because if you could get over it, then that person didn't mean as much to you as they should do. So it's not something that you'll ever get over, but you will learn to live with it, and you will find ways through. And life is always worth living, and there are so many things that you can do to enjoy your life and to help other people enjoy theirs. It takes time, but you'll learn to live with it.
Thank you so very much, Florence. Really, it means so much to us that you've come in to share this.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us, Florence. I know our listeners will find what you've said inspiring. You've been listening to the Cruse Care podcast. Many thanks for joining us. If you'd like further information about Cruse Bereavement Care services, including our National Bereavement Support Helpline, please visit our website at www.cruse.org.uk.